Did you know Haytham Canoe was supposed to play a much larger role in Assassin's Creed Rogue? Or perhaps Connor and Aveline were going to be a love interest? Or maybe even Ezio was supposed to travel back in time to fight the dinosaurs? Okay, maybe not that last one. Well, in this video I want to explore cut ideas and content that did not make it into their respective Assassin's Creed game. Now when I was researching for this video, I was honestly baffled by how many amazing things were removed from the game, and I think you guys will be too. I'm not focusing on these pieces of cut content to regret what could have been for the franchise, but rather to find interest in the concepts that were not included. With 13 mainline games, there's definitely bound to be a lot of unused or removed stuff, whether it's from leaks, development or just early concepts. I'll be sure not to include speculative information or anything of that sort. The cut content in this video are things that are confirmed, removed or changed. I could have added so much more in this video, but most of the other cut content are minor changes that you barely notice and are also not 100% confirmed. Oh, and this video will contain spoilers, so do bear that in mind. Anyway, without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's just begin by exploring the cut content in Assassin's Creed Rogue. Now, I had to go through an 8-year-old interview to find some of this information, but it was worth it in the end. Now first off, I'm a pretty big fan of some of the locations in the game, whether it's the River Valley or perhaps the Sleepy Hollow. But did you know that there was a second major city that was cut entirely from Assassin's Creed Rogue? Now despite me spending a fair amount of time exploring the world of Rogue, there always did seem to be an air of incompleteness. Of course, this could just be because it was designed to complement Unity rather than to stand on its own. So during an interview back in 2015 with Richard Fares, who was the lead writer for Assassin's Creed Rogue, he mentioned that an important location was removed from the final version of the game. This removed location was intended to be a very important area where assassins gathered, and Shay, who of course we know is a protagonist, would visit this specific location twice, first as an assassin and then later as a Templar returning there to cause chaos. The exact details of this location remain undisclosed for confidentiality reasons with the higher ups at Ubisoft.
There was an environment that was actually cut because of production issues. We were planning to have 2 sequences of the game there, including the opening sequence, and then you would return as a Templar again to face the Brotherhood.
So this forces us to ask the question, what exactly was this removed location? Well, given the historical and geographical context of Assassin's Creed Rogue, Quebec comes out as a likely candidate for this cut content. You see, in the 18th century, Quebec was a prominent and notable city, yet it's conspicuously absent from the American series of the franchise, which included lesser known colonial locations, like New Orleans and Port-au-Prince. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but the North Atlantic map in Assassin's Creed Rogue features 2 exits, one leading presumably to New York, and the other towards the St. Lawrence River, hinting at a pathway to Quebec. Now realistically, Quebec being a stronghold for assassins does make sense historically, as the French who allied with the assassins in the game were prominent there. Including Quebec could have led to some pretty interesting storylines, like a pretty important mission set in the plains of Abraham during the 7 Years' War. This could have included Shay in an assassination mission to take out Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, whilst Liam would assassinate a figure such as James Wolfe. The removal of this supposed city being Quebec is likely due to budget and resource limitations at Ubisoft Sophia, who developed the game. They were probably more focused on Assassin's Creed Unity, which may have affected the development of Rogue. I mean, that could explain why it just reused every asset from Black Flag. This piece of cut content is one of those situations that makes you wonder what could have been. This means what story could have taken place there, or how important this removed city would be. Originally, the plan for Assassin's Creed Rogue was for Shay to work on 1 or 2 in-depth missions with every assassin from the Brotherhood before his eventual betrayal to becoming a Templar. These missions were not basic training sequences like we saw in the final game, but instead missions to deepen Shay's relationship with each assassin and make his eventual betrayal a lot more emotional and impactful. However, due to time constraints and programming challenges, this idea was removed and reduced to the current set of training missions that we see in the final version of the game.
Originally, we wanted to have Shay work at least on 1 or 2 missions with every assassin from the Brotherhood.
Not just like these little tiny training sequences.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like we wanted to have like full missions with these characters, just to develop their relationship a little more. In terms of gameplay, what we wanted to show was sort of to foreshadow like what these people do, like because each of them were experts in a different field, and we really wanted to show that to the player. Once you became a Templar, the idea was that you would almost be afraid of them even more because you would have seen them in action before.
Another piece of cut content from Rogue is that originally there was an idea to explore a period in Shay's life immediately after betraying the Brotherhood, where he would be living in New York feeling destroyed, possibly drunk and getting into brawls. This concept would see Shay completely distraught and unable to accept what just happened to him and the fact that he had just turned his back on Achilles. Sadly, this story beat was intended to show his struggle to accept what had happened. However, this was not pursued, as it couldn't be made interesting in terms of gameplay.
At some point, we thought about having a beat in the story where Shay would, right after he betrayed the Brotherhood, while he was being nursed back into health, to health in New York, we wanted to have maybe have him live a couple of years where he wouldn't start working with the Templars right away. The original vision I had for this is that he would be this totally destroyed. He would probably be drunk all the time, getting into brawls, and just being completely unable to accept what just happened to him. And the fact that he had to turn his back, he was forced to turn his back on Achilles.
During development of Assassin's Creed Rogue, there were plans to make Rogue have a much longer section of the game when Shay's an assassin. However, to maintain a balance and ensure that the Templar part of the game did not feel too short, this idea was cut entirely from development.
If we would have made the assassin part too long, then it would have felt more like an Assassin's Creed game, where the Templar bit would be maybe, 1/3 or 1/4 of the game. And we really wanted to have that switch quickly enough in the story.
Now that part got me thinking. Based on that interview clip, it seems like Rogue could have been a much more developed and fleshed out game. That's why I always say Assassin's Creed Rogue is a game of wasted potential. Perhaps if the assassin part of the game was longer, it would have resonated with me a lot more, but unfortunately it's just a case of what if. This one is more of unused content rather than cut content. It's more of a concept that was thought of by the lead writer of Assassin's Creed Rogue during development, and that has to do with Haytham Canoe and his limited usage. So initially there was a possibility of using Haytham Canoe more extensively in the game's story. However, due to the story established in the Forsaken novel, which highlights Haytham's life, they faced limitations. The novel discusses Haytham leaving America and returning much later, creating a timeline gap that they couldn't touch without contradicting the established lore. Therefore, they decided not to use Haytham as the main character for Assassin's Creed Rogue. Instead, he was portrayed as almost a secondary mentor to Shay, allowing them to introduce other characters like Monroe and maintain narrative consistency with the existing Assassin's Creed lore.
In AC3, when you start playing, you play Haytham for a while, and then you sort of get to set up the order, or at least reorganize the order into a more structured organization in the colonies. And then Forsaken starts, and basically Haytham leaves America and comes back in 57 or 58. So there is a big gap there that we couldn't touch unless we made Forsaken non-canon. And this is not something we wanted to do.
This piece of cut content is one that I feel might disappoint quite a fair amount of people, and that is Connor from Assassin's Creed 3 and Aveline from Liberation was supposed to have been a love interest. This scrap concept is a pretty fascinating glimpse into the what could have been of Assassin's Creed, because there is a lot of them. So during a Q&A session relating to the DLC of Assassin's Creed 3 that took place all the way back in 2013, Ubisoft creative director at the time, Mark Alexis Cole, was asked the question if we were going to see Aveline play some sort of role with Connor, and surprisingly he answered stating that Aveline in the early pre-production of the DLC was going to have a love interest with Connor, but that idea was then removed, simply because both characters' motivations and personalities did not align together well, so they dropped it entirely. Fun fact, that exact Q&A session is not on the internet anymore, so I had to use a website called the Wayback Machine to go back in time to find the link to this Q&A. It took some time digging for it, but I eventually found it. Now going back to that potential relationship, am I the only one that finds this to be a missed opportunity for quite a few reasons? For one, whilst both Aveline and Connor operate in different settings, with Connor in the American colonies and Aveline in the southern United States, both characters fight against oppression and share similar values, which personally I feel like it's the perfect love interest. But of course, this decision to remove this idea makes you wonder what interesting story elements and depths this romance could have brought to the series. Not all ideas thought up by developers end up in the final game, so this was one of those what if moments. Let's delve into something a little more recent, and that is a piece of cut content from Assassin's Creed Mirage. So first I have to give credit to Slider-V2, who I'm sure a lot of you know. He's a reputable modder and YouTuber. I'll leave a link to his channel in the description. So quite literally 3 days after Mirage was released, Slider-V2 managed to discover an unused post-credit scene in the files of the game. Now this will not contain any Mirage spoilers, so you don't need to worry about that. This scene that was data mined not only hints at an important shift in the series storyline, but also points to the future direction of the Assassin's Creed universe. I'll play for you now, and then after I'll analyze and explain what a lot of it means.
Hey, you there?
I'm here.
I just filed my report, did you see? Precursor GM confirmed.
Are you serious?
Yeah, watch the playback. Scrub to the end.
Damn. 3 years of doing this, I've never even seen a memory ghost.
It's a rare find, don't beat yourself up. But this 9th century DNA, it's a gold mine. You said it was collected by William Miles?
I was just reading the data file. Is that what I said?
Double check, cause that's a name attached to a lot of interesting samples.
Miles. Why does that sound familiar?
Did you skip the history seminars?
Obviously not, it's mandatory.
Assassin Mandor, one of the last before the Great Shift. You don't remember?
The shift was 21st century. Ancient history. What?
Can you just pretend to do your job?
Lay off.
I'm serious.
Look, I'm getting a coffee. You want one?
Yeah, can't say no to that.
All right, meet you there.
Now before I do talk about what just happened, you are able to download this cutscene as a mod and have it play out in the game. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you're interested. So the cutscene you just saw points to Assassin's Creed Hex, a name that was previously referred to as Assassin's Creed Neo. This suggests that what's revealed in this scene might play a pretty important role in upcoming games, which of course does excite a lot of people, especially regarding a major shift in the overall modern day story. In this data mine cutscene, a modern radio antenna appears in a desert setting from the 9th century in Assassin's Creed Mirage. Of course, for one, that's just out of place, isn't it? This strangeness makes you wonder about the game's true time frame. The audio features a conversation between two people called Animus Operators, who talk about genetic memories that make up the story of Mirage. Surprisingly, they seem to be from a time much later than ours, even referring to the 21st century as ancient history, which just sounds like time travel to me. Of course, this twist gets even more deeper with the mention of William Miles, who we know is a key figure in the current Assassin's Creed games. He's described as an assassin mentor, one of the last before the Great Shift, a term used to describe a crucial event from the 21st century, which of course during that cutscene is now a thing of the past. This conversation suggests that this scene is set in a long time after ours. Now Ubisoft have not exactly confirmed if this is authentic, but I'm pretty sure it is. I mean, there's no way somebody can develop a cutscene like that with voice actors. And also Slider V2, the person who data mined it, is pretty reputable. So if it is true, this scene would be a very bold and unexpected turn in the story. It kind of reminds me of the planned ending for Assassin's Creed 3, which involved a space journey for Desmond. I'll talk more about that near the end of the video. Now the reason for this data mine modern day cutscene is not clear. Did Ubisoft take the story in a completely different direction? Or did this cutscene reveal too much information about the franchise way too soon, so that's why it was cut from the game entirely? If anything, that just leaves us with more questions than answers, especially about what the quote-unquote Great Shift is, and who these characters are. But I decided to use a bit of logic. What we do know is that the upcoming Assassin's Creed games are expected to follow a more connected story, especially with the introduction of Assassin's Creed Infinity. This platform aims to make the storytelling more coherent, unlike the somewhat fragmented narrative of previous games. Shifting the modern day of Assassin's Creed to the future honestly could just refresh the series in my opinion, bringing in new mysteries about what happened between now and the future time. The three main locations in Assassin's Creed 3 are Boston, New York, and of course the Frontier. However, there's one important location that was cut from the final game, and that was the city of Philadelphia. For those familiar with this city, its absence in a game that's quite literally centered on the Revolutionary War is quite confusing. The decision to not include Philadelphia in Assassin's Creed 3 was not made lightly. According to Alex Hutchinson, the game's creative director, Philadelphia was initially on the drawing board for open world exploration. The city, known for its structured grid layout, a legacy of Pennsylvania's first governor William Penn, and modelled after European cities, was initially seen as an exciting addition. It was about to be the very first city in Assassin's Creed designed on a grid system, offering a unique architectural style compared to the organically evolved cityscapes of previous games. However, during development, the team faced issues with incorporating Philadelphia's design into the game. Hutchinson pointed out that the city's grid pattern, the flatness, and the wide streets were challenging for an open world game like Assassin's Creed 3. These aspects, which I'm pretty sure are true to history and authentically important, did not fit well with the game's core elements of parkour and stealth. The broad streets and lack of tall buildings would have made the free running and navigation less exciting for players. Now what's interesting is that despite the removal of Philadelphia in the game, the city's influence isn't completely missing from the game. Important events still take place in the city, maintaining its role in the revolution. We might not be able to explore Philadelphia as we would with Boston or New York, but the city's historical essence is still part of the game's story. Do you remember this character from Assassin's Creed Black Flag? Well, if you don't, his name is Tiburon, and his role in Black Flag was being a mute personal bodyguard of Governor Torres. Although he was not showcased as a Templar, his unwavering loyalty to Governor Torres made him a valuable asset to the Order. Now, interestingly, he actually had a completely different role in Black Flag. Darby McDevitt back in 2013 said this: Tiburon had a slightly bigger role, but the boss fight with him in Sequence 2 was too easy to exploit. Cut. Of course, referring to removing the original plan with him. In this original plan, it was supposed to be Edward and Tiburon engaging in a fight at the end of Sequence 2, which would end with Edward Kenway being defeated. For gameplay reasons, that actual fight between the two was cut during development. However, what's interesting is that in the Black Flag novel, that fight actually takes place, and Edward Kenway's final lines to Tiburon still refers to it. Assassin's Creed Victory. I honestly could have made an entirely new video just focusing on this part of the video, but I've decided why not just stick it here. So during the year of 2014, there was a lot of leaks coming out from nowhere that featured screenshots and a 7-minute video that was only seen by Kotaku employees. Now we know a game like Assassin's Creed Codename Red is just a codename and a placeholder for what the eventual name will be. The same is said for Assassin's Creed Victory. This was the placeholder name for Assassin's Creed Syndicate, but that's not what the focus is here. The screenshots and description of Victory is nothing like what we saw in the final game of Syndicate. So what happened to the dark and gritty leaks of Victory? Why did the game look quite different? The original Assassin's Creed Victory concept seemed more appealing, especially in terms of its darker and grittier tone, which is better suited to the Victorian London setting. In real life history, Victorian London is not exactly considered bright and clear. The setting of the final game that we got, being Syndicate, is more near the ending of the Industrial Revolution, which is an era where we slowly saw the introduction of machines powered by steam engines doing jobs that used to be done by children and workers. So if anything, real life Victorian London was dark and gritty. Assassin's Creed Victory was originally supposed to feature a sole protagonist instead of what we have now with Evie and Jacob. That sole protagonist was named Samuel Fay, and he had a pretty cool outfit. Sadly, his outfit was never released in the game. However, they did transfer his outfit to the character named George Westhouse, who is the person we see at the start of Syndicate very briefly, and he's never shown again for some strange reason. Now, one of the most striking differences in these early concepts was the depiction of the assassins themselves. Unlike the final game, which focused on the Fry twins, the initial idea for Victory hinted at a broader brotherhood of assassins already established in London. Take this image for example. It depicts a group of assassins, indicating a key theme of the game. Now, this differs from the final game, which primarily features a duo of assassins, which of course we know are the Fry twins. The original plan might have included a larger group of assassins already present in London, rather than just the character Henry Green as seen in the final version. I personally find this approach much more appealing. In the image, there's a woman in red standing behind an early version of Jacob. Now honestly, she might be the other main character, Evie, but it's not certain. On the far right, there's another female character which could have also been an earlier Evie, so it's not determined as to who is actually who. We also got artwork that was created during very early development that showcases a much darker tone of Victorian London. In fact, these pictures are so dark that there were even public hangings taking place and executions. And also, there were even theories that Assassin's Creed Victory would take place during a later time period in Victorian London and not what we currently have with Syndicate. Now, this particular piece of cut content is one of the more interesting ones relating to Assassin's Creed Victory, and that was early concepts for the idea of underwater exploration in the River Thames, kind of similar to Black Flag's voyages. This does sound quite interesting, especially knowing how polluted the waters of Victorian London were. It could have offered some sort of challenging environment for exploration and missions. Of course, this idea was cut entirely from development, most likely due to the technical challenges or story considerations. There was even quite a lot more customization for Jacob's character. These images you're seeing on screen are all design choices that were never actually implemented into the final game. We also saw images of what appeared to be Jacob in the outfit that was later given to George Westhouse in the final game, and also what appears to be a gang member, specifically one of the Rooks. It's pretty evident that his outfit is a lot different to what we have in the final game, which personally looks a lot better than what we currently have. It seems more fitting for where the game is set. I don't believe the Rooks in the final game even had top hats like that. Now, these next few pieces of early development artwork align with the idea of the darker and grittier tone of Victorian London. The clothing shown appears to be from a later era, suggesting that gangs weren't as prominent initially. The game might have planned to include gangs as a gameplay element, similar to the thieves or courtesans in the Ezio series of Assassin's Creed. It seems that at some point in development, gangs might have been a more important part of the game. Even more, the art shows a clear contrast between the attire and body language language of the wealthy and poor, subtly highlighting social issues that were not fully explored in the final game. So yeah, the transition from the game changing to Assassin's Creed Victory to Syndicate showcases a shift not just in the game's name but also in its thematic focus, character dynamics and even the story potential. You see, while Syndicate is a relatively decent game in its own right, it makes you wonder based on these early concepts of Victory that the game could have perhaps been a lot more darker and different. During a data mine of Assassin's Creed 2, the modder Slider V2 managed to data mine an early model of Sean Hastings. In fact, the discovered unused Sean model appears to be the same as what an early concept art of him looked like. Now, I'll be honest, I am so glad that this unused model was not the final face model for Sean, because he looks like he belongs in the movie Shaun of the Dead, which ironically the main character is also named Sean. He also looks like the off-brand Wellstone Raider. For my British people watching, I know you know what I'm talking about there.
If you want some, I'll give it you. You want to do it, mate?
I can admit the details are much more apparent, but he looks much older and less appealing. Anyway, Slider V2 managed to put together the unused face model and implement it into the cutscenes in Assassin's Creed 2. So what are your thoughts on this? Does he suit this look? Of course, since we're so used to seeing the Sean we all know, it is definitely a bit odd. We also got unused character models of both Leonardo da Vinci and Mario Auditore, which are showcased as a fair bit older with their unused models. In Assassin's Creed 2, only Ezio Auditore was a character that we saw slightly get older. And speaking of Ezio, he also had an unused character model, but it's not to do with his facial features, but instead his hair and clothing. I'm kind of glad they did not go with this original concept because I prefer the robes that Ezio wore in the final game of Assassin's Creed 2. It's much more easier on the eye with a more simplistic colour approach. The last piece of cut content that's related to unused character models is a bit different. Within the game files, an unused character model of Viola de Pazzi, who is identified as Vieri's sister, can be found. She was initially planned to be featured in an extra mission, similar to what we saw in the Christina missions in Brotherhood, but this content was ultimately not included in the final game. Now, thanks to the brilliance of Slider V2, he was able to determine information related to the mission itself. So the mission starts off with Ezio talking to a mercenary of some sort, and then after that Ezio was supposed to find Viola, tail her, and then supposedly beat up or kill her personal guards. But here's the thing that caught me off guard, and that is there was also a romance scene related to this mission between Ezio and Viola, where the mission I just discussed would end with Ezio sparing her and then following up with a kiss. Now, I know Ezio is a stud, but that's just so random, and if anything, I'm kind of glad this mission was not in the final game. During one of the gameplay showcases at E3 of Assassin's Creed Origins, there were locations to the east of the Nile, and one of them was an area marked as Heliopolis Nome. However, in the final game, this area was completely removed from the game. In fact, if you try to go to where it's supposed to be, it's just an empty desert area. Now, just a very brief history lesson for you. Nomes in ancient Egypt were pretty straightforward. They operated like city-states, each with its own capital led by a nomarch, all under the rule of the pharaoh. It's strange that Heliopolis was removed from the final game, because at one point during the story, Apollodorus himself said he was the nomarch of Heliopolis at one point. The fact that Heliopolis is talked about during the story shows that this area was once part of the game and was removed for unknown reasons. Now, this is strange because Heliopolis was an important city during ancient Egypt. In fact, there were famous figures like Homer, Pythagoras, Plato, and Orpheus that frequently visited the city. In fact, it's not just Heliopolis, because if you played Origins, you would have noticed that the whole east bank of the River Nile in general is showcased as just empty desert, both in exploration and content. I believe there's only one single papyrus puzzle there. However, in reality, the east bank of the Nile is as vibrant and lively as the west bank. Present day Cairo, which doesn't exist in the game's time period, is actually located east of Giza. This showcase in the final game is quite odd. It is understandable that Ubisoft might not have wanted to invest a lot of time and resources into an area that doesn't play a major role in the story. However, this is a bit contradicting, considering the mountains in the east bank of the Nile are quite detailed, and in reality do not exist at all. Now, what Ubisoft should have done with this empty desert is at least add a few obscure locations, or perhaps a small town, because at least this would not involve investing a lot of time and resources. It just would have made the game feel more immersive and realistic, instead of looking at a massive empty desert space when in reality there were things there. During an E3 2013 gameplay showcase for Assassin's Creed Black Flag, the mission Do Not Go Gently was showcased. but it was showcased quite a bit differently than what we saw in the final game. The E3 gameplay showcases a version of Black Flag that feels more authentic. Edward Kenway feels more part of the world, blending in crowds rather than standing out. We can see him sitting on benches talking to people and even flirting with this woman. We can also see him blending with groups sitting on the floor and even drinking the rum with them. Compare this to crowd blending with Ezio or Connor, and it's night and day. In those games we see them just stand there in a crowd and not interact with anyone or anything. So this E3 gameplay for Black Flag was a massive upgrade. However, as all good things Ubisoft initially show us, there will be consequences. And unfortunately, the consequence that this upgraded crowd blending was not implemented into the final version of Black Flag. In the E3 demo, we even had the ability to crouch whenever you weren't hiding in a bush, which wasn't the case in the final game. And just in general, the interactions during blending seemed more realistic in the demo compared to what we had with the final thing. The groups of NPCs were not just random groups, but instead these NPCs are engaging in conversations, playing games and just doing other activities. So it makes you wonder, why was this advanced crowd blending and crouching outside the bushes cut entirely from the game? To me, it just makes no sense for it to be removed, because for one, it's not like they had to develop it because we quite literally saw it in the gameplay demo, and for two, it's not resource heavy. I guess Ubisoft did not want to improve their own games. Now, staying on the topic of Assassin's Creed Black Flag, did you know that the Hookblade from Assassin's Creed Revelations was part of Black Flag until it got scrapped and removed entirely? Now, the Hookblade, as we know, is an upgrade to the Hidden Blade, and it was given to an older Ezio by use of Tazim during Assassin's Creed Revelations. This tool featured a hook at the end of the blade, and it improved Ezio's overall combat abilities and movement. It pretty much allowed him to traverse and navigate his surroundings much more efficiently, and it was an addition to the game that we all loved. But the reason it was removed from Black Flag is actually pretty hilarious. So Darby McDevitt, who was a developer for the game, decided against including the Hookblade in Assassin's Creed Black Flag. He felt that adding the Hookblade might unintentionally reference the stereotypical image of pirates with hook hands, which I'm pretty sure is a portrayal that has persisted in popular culture for a long time. In reality, actual pirates rarely, if ever, use hooks in place of their hands. Now, although the Hookblade is not featured in any later Assassin's Creed games after Revelations, I can recall moments of Edward Kenway's movement in the game and recall the advantages provided by the Hookblade. One of the notable features of the Hookblade was how it allowed Ezio to quickly move through Constantinople by ziplining with a rope. While Edward Kenway does not exactly use a zipline in Black Flag, his movements, particularly when climbing up ship masts, are comparably fast. He uses a technique where he kicks the ship's rigging to quickly ascend the mast, similar in speed to Ezio's ziplining, and then on top of that, Ezio can swing from ropes, maintaining the sense of agility and swiftness that the Hookblade offered. So yeah, whilst the Hookblade may seem like a pretty interesting choice for a game like Black Flag, its removal by Darby McDevitt was a decision that kind of made sense. It's just a shame that we'll probably never see the Hookblade return to any other Assassin's Creed game. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, we are going to get a grapple hook in Assassin's Creed Codename Red, so maybe that can be a good replacement. We'll just have to wait and see. Assassin's Creed 3 stirred quite mixed reactions. It's a game that players typically either adore or dislike, with little middle ground. A notable piece of content that didn't make it to the final version and was removed from the game was an emotional speech by Connor at the game's ending. This speech was meant to showcase Connor's personal development and his contemplations throughout the events of the game. Its removal is unfortunate, as it would have added depth and a fitting closure to the game's ending. The reason for it being removed is unknown, but it's one of those additions that would have made the story feel more connecting to the player. For those that are interested, here's the speech to listen to.
My father left those for me. Mother, father, I am sorry. I have failed you both. I made a promise to protect our people. I thought if I could stop the Templars, if I could keep the revolution free from their influence, that those I supported would do what was right. They did, I suppose, do what was right for them. As for you, Father, I thought I might unite us, that we would forget the past and forge a better future. In time, I believed you could be made to see the world as I did, to understand. But it was just a dream. This too I should have known. Were we not meant to live in peace then? Is that it? Are we born to argue? To fight? So many voices, each demanding something else. It has been hard at times, but never harder than today. To see all I worked for, perverted, discarded, forgotten. You would say I have described the whole of history, Father. Are you smiling then? Hoping I might speak the words you long to hear? To validate you? To say that all along you were right? I will not. Even now, faced as I am with the truth of your cold words,
We're going to stay on the theme of Assassin's Creed 3 and talk about a feature that was cut from the game very early on, and that was canoes. So early promotional images of the game featured a canoe, suggesting it would be a key method of moving around in the game. This idea excited many people, myself included, as it promised a fresh and engaging way to explore the game's world. However, when the game was released, the canoe was cut entirely from the game, and I remember it did cause quite the stir online. Thankfully, we did get an explanation for the removal. So Alex Hutchinson, who is the game's creative director, explained why the canoe was removed. So to put it straight, he basically mentioned that during the initial stages of development, the team added a canoe, but as the game developed, they realized that the main character Connor was already pretty skilled at moving to the game's environment. So realistically, next to his skills, the canoe seemed dull and unnecessary. He also explained that the decision to remove the canoe wasn't easy. Since Connor could already move around effectively, the canoe didn't really add anything new or valuable to the game. Now, even though the original Assassin's Creed 3 did not feature canoeing, it still offers substantial sailing gameplay, including the introduction of naval battles. Additionally, in the game after, being Assassin's Creed Liberation, we did have the opportunity to use a canoe in the bayou areas. Now, what's even more interesting is that the canoe image from Assassin's Creed 3 briefly resurfaced on the store page for the remastered version of the game, only to then be discreetly taken down later. This removal likely occurred after Ubisoft recognized that its inclusion might be misleading, as the canoe feature was not actually in the game. During the development of Assassin's Creed 3, there were quite a fair amount of notable changes in regard to its portrayal of historical practices. Initially, the game included a feature where Connor could scalp enemies. Now, if you're unaware as to what scalping is, it's basically the act of cutting up or tearing apart of the human scalp with hair attached from the head, and generally occurred in warfare, with the scalp being a trophy. In Assassin's Creed 3, this concept was revealed in early footage, shown at a behind closed doors event in London, displaying Connor, who is half English, half Native American descent, engaging in the act of scalping an enemy with his tomahawk as a form of gruesome proof for a successful assassination. The early footage, which was captured before the game entered full development, and it showed a fast-paced and brutal side of combat. However, as Ubisoft Montreal delved deeper into historical research, they discovered that scalping was not a practice carried out by the Mohawk tribe, to which Connor belongs. So ultimately, this led to the decision to remove scalping from the game entirely. I don't really mind it not being included in the game, because it's fucking brutal. Perhaps it could have made the game feel a lot more darker, which is a complete contrast compared to something like collecting feathers in Assassin's Creed 2. There's even more cut content relating to Connor, and instead of scalping, canoes and a speech, Connor at one point was going to wield a chain blade as a weapon. This chain blade would act as a long-range hidden blade. However, the idea and concept of this was eventually removed from the game entirely, because the team at Ubisoft felt that it was heading down too much of a fantasy route. So what they did, instead of implementing the chain blade, is replace it with the rope dart, which is something we know is in the final version of the game. Ubisoft Montreal introduced a dynamic environmental feature in Assassin's Creed 3 that significantly changed gameplay, and that was the passage of seasons. Since we know the game is set in the northeastern part of America, the game spans a considerable period, allowing us to experience a shift from summertime to the harsh winters of the era. The good thing about Assassin's Creed 3's seasonal changes is that they're not cosmetic, but also gameplay related. Winter in particular plays an important role in the setting, so as creative director Hutchinson emphasizes, we wanted winter to matter. If you lived in the northeast of America in this period, winter is scary. If you're not prepared for winter, you will die. So realistically, this would also mean lakes would freeze over, right? Well, sadly that's not the case, because this feature, whilst it was introduced at one point during development, was ultimately removed entirely from the final game. It's a weird one because in 2012, before the game was released, creative director Alex Hutchinson himself was so adamant on this feature being a thing. So when it was removed from the development and cut entirely, it was a bit strange, especially considering the fact that we got no explanation as to why it was removed. So I guess it's a case of what if. Have you ever noticed in a game like Origins we have naval combat, or at least we kind of do with a few missions with Aya, and then in a game like Odyssey we had naval combat in the open world. But what about Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Well, we know that there is no naval combat at all in that game, and that raises a question, which is why? Well, fun fact, Valhalla initially did seem to include naval combat at one point. In the development of Valhalla, the team initially toyed with the idea of including naval combat. Given the Viking theme of Valhalla, it seemed natural to explore this possibility of sea battles, potentially involving dramatic scenes of ships exchanging flaming arrows. However, as the development progressed and the team concluded more in-depth research into Viking history, they discovered that naval combat was not as prevalent in Viking warfare as they previously thought. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings rarely engaged in battles at sea, so upon understanding that Vikings didn't often engage in naval battles, the game developers chose to alter the naval aspects of Valhalla. The game's map mainly consists of rivers and not large oceans, which influenced this decision. As a result, ships in the game were primarily used for transport, not for combat at sea. That's why when you travel on the sea in Valhalla, it's always with a longboat that has no combat capabilities. This adjustment made sure that the game accurately reflected the Viking era, focusing on their skills in sailing and discovering new lands rather than on maritime fighting. But that got me thinking, if Ubisoft did not include naval combat for historical reasons, then why on earth are we meeting Odin, Thor and Loki in the game? Explain yourself, Ubisoft. This one isn't that exciting, so I'll keep it short. So during the demo of Assassin's Creed 3 at E3, Connor visits a small settlement in the frontier, where he receives side missions and interacts with a soldier before then going on a mission in Sequence 8 to assassinate a man named Silas Assassination. However, this settlement and the missions associated with it are not present in the release game. Instead, in Sequence 8 of the final game, Connor finds himself imprisoned in New York. So this means that Silas Assassination, who the demo suggests Connor assassinates in Sequence 8, was actually killed much earlier, in Sequence 2 by Haytham and his buddies. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is one of the more important games in the series, and it underwent a fascinating evolution during its development. Initially, it wasn't conceived as a standalone game, but as part of Assassin's Creed 2. The original plan for Assassin's Creed 2 included Rome as an explorable city. However, due to time constraints, this aspect was ultimately cut from the game. The storyline was initially set to culminate in Ezio Auditore's story by assassinating Rodrigo Borgia. This plot point was also altered late in the development process. The decision to develop Assassin's Creed Brotherhood as a separate game was influenced by the financial success of Assassin's Creed 2. Ubisoft recognized the potential for another release before Assassin's Creed 3 and decided to expand upon the existing assets and concepts of Assassin's Creed 2. This led to Brotherhood being developed, using retextured assets from its predecessor and incorporating ideas that were previously set aside. Oh, and what's even more interesting is that the development of Assassin's Creed Revelations also went through a similar transformation. It began as a game for the Nintendo 3DS titled Lost Legacy, but was eventually developed into a full game to maintain annual releases of the franchise. If you paid close attention, you might have noticed that the original trailer for Assassin's Creed 1 showcased Altair with a crossbow on his back. However, this weapon was not available in the actual game. The reason behind its omission? Well, Ubisoft took out the crossbow due to concerns about not being historically accurate. This is somewhat ironic, given that the Assassin's Creed series has since moved away from the strict historical accuracy. Another reason Ubisoft mentioned for removing the crossbow was that playtesters were using it to eliminate targets from afar, which disrupted the intended immersive experience of the game. Now, interestingly, the historical accuracy argument for removing the crossbow has its flaws. You see, handheld crossbows existed 1,000 years before Altair's time, especially in ancient China. Also, within the game's own storyline, Altair actually had a crossbow himself, as shown in the game Altair's Chronicles. Here's a fascinating blend of a cut feature and an Easter egg from the first Assassin's Creed game. When you're leaving Masyaf at the start of the game and then heading towards the path that leads to the other cities, you might notice a unique character. If you use Eagle Vision, this character is highlighted in red, unlike other NPCs who are usually marked in different colours. This will of course immediately raise suspicion and curiosity. Now, the story behind this character is quite interesting. He's a traitor that's named Jamal, and he was the insider who helped another traitor named Masun open Masyaf's gates for the Templars during their siege. In the game, if you quietly assassinate this red highlighted character, nothing significant happens. However, However, if you attack him openly, it provokes nearby assassins to come after you. The interesting part is that Jamal was originally meant to be a target in the game, but for reasons unknown, this mission was cut from the final version. Despite this, Ubisoft creatively turned it into an Easter egg, leaving Jamal in the game as a sort of hidden detail for observant players to discover. His role and the mission he was part of remains one of the most unsolved mysteries of the game's development. The first Assassin's Creed game had an interesting aspect that a lot of people might not know about, and that was that there was plans to include a co-op multiplayer feature in Assassin's Creed 1. This detail was shared by Julian Merceron, who was Ubisoft's technical director at that time. He revealed that the original intention was to incorporate a multiplayer mode in the game. What's particularly fascinating is that due to a bug, elements of this intended multiplayer functionality were still present in the final game. According to Merceron, if players connected a second controller to the console, a second character resembling Altair would appear on the screen. This occurrence was somewhat amusing as the development team hadn't thoroughly tested these features and mistakenly thought they had been disabled. It's worth noting that it wasn't until Assassin's Creed Brotherhood that a multiplayer mode was officially introduced to the series, and co-op gameplay debuted in Assassin's Creed Unity. The attempt by Ubisoft to integrate multiplayer features in the very first Assassin's Creed game shows their early interest in exploring this concept. Had this feature been successfully implemented in the first game, it might have significantly altered how players would experience the game. A pretty cool feature which was originally planned for Origins but later removed was something known as Juno Events. Now, Juno is a character from the game's lore, who is an ezio deity who aimed to dominate the world. However, Ubisoft tossed her story into the comic books, ending it there. Now, interestingly, Juno was supposed to make an appearance in Assassin's Creed Origins. During the game's presentation at Gamescom, icons labeled as Juno Events were noticed. This revelation sparked excitement among many YouTubers and gamers, anticipating Juno's return to the game series. However, this excitement was short-lived. When Assassin's Creed Origins was released, there was no trace of these so-called Juno events. In fact, Juno was not mentioned at all in the game. So what happened to these Juno events? Well, it turns out that what we know as the Trial of the Gods in Assassin's Creed Origins was originally meant to be called Juno Events. This is evident from a concept art screenshot for the game, where the URL link includes the words Juno Events. So essentially, the Trial of the Gods was initially conceptualized as Juno Events, but was renamed, possibly because Juno wasn't intended to feature in Assassin's Creed Origins. This decision could be related to the complicated timeline of the Assassin's Creed series. The modern day setting of Uprising, which is a comic series, occurs before the events of Origins, and since Juno was given a physical form in Uprising, it would not have made narrative sense for her to appear in Origins. So consequently, she was completely removed from the game. In Assassin's Creed Origins, Aya was initially planned to be the main character instead of Bayek. The original storyline had Bayek being killed off early in the game, which would have shifted the focus to Aya, making her the primary playable character. However, this plan was changed due to the influence of the marketing team and Serge Haskell at Ubisoft. Haskell, who is controversially regarded, and the marketing department insisted on altering the storyline to center around Bayek instead of Aya. And their reason for this? Well, they believed that a female protagonist would not be as well received or successful, which is why most Assassin's Creed games feature male leads. While I personally didn't have an issue with Aya not being the main character since Bayek became one of my favorite characters, the reasoning behind this decision is fucking abysmal. It's worth noting that this wasn't an isolated incident, because in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, Evie Frye was supposed to have a more significant role. However, Serge Haskell reportedly opposed this idea as well, stating that women don't sell, leading to a diminished role for Evie in the game. This kind of decision making reflects a broader issue within the gaming industry regarding the representation and roles of female characters. And to end off this video, let's go out with a bang, quite literally, because that's what this piece of cut content is, and that is Desmond's alternative story. So you see, the original plan for the Assassin's Creed trilogy, as envisioned by co-creator Patrice Désilets, was to finish off in an epic finale featuring Desmond Miles. This ending would have seen Desmond lead a modern day battle against Abstergo, using the skills he learned from his ancestors, including Altair and Ezio. A surprising twist in this plan was that Desmond and Lucy were to start a new civilization, symbolically similar to Adam and Eve. In a pretty old interview, Patrice Désilets mentioned that Lucy's name was inspired by the ancient hominid Australopithecus afarensis, and Desmond and Lucy were originally destined to embark on a journey in a spaceship, which was a concept that presented a very bold modern day shift. However, by the time Assassin's Creed 3 was released back in 2012, the storyline had undergone significant changes. While Desmond's arc ended with his death and the present day conflict with Abstergo was somewhat resolved, many details from the original vision were altered. The series had grown beyond the original trilogy with Ezio's story. Desmond had left Ubisoft due to disagreements, and Lucy's character was written off entirely. The ongoing role of Abstergo as the antagonist simply just continued. The idea of ending the modern day story with a spaceship was linked to the potential extraterrestrial origins of the ezio. The concept included a secret ezio bunker that could function as a spacecraft. Despite these early ideas, the trilogy did not end as initially planned, and the spaceship concept was not envisioned in the series. Now, what's quite interesting is that some elements of this original spaceship idea appear to resurface in Valhalla. The game's ending features Layla joining Desmond's spirit in a digital realm called the Grey, evoking the whole Adam and Eve imagery. This suggests that certain original concepts were revisited and adapted in later games, leaving the door open for the spaceship idea to potentially return in future Assassin's Creed games. In fact, if you remember near the start of the video when I talked about Assassin's Creed Mirage's modern day cutscene that got removed, the people in that cutscene were from the future, so that's all I'm gonna say. Oh, and I'll play a small part of the interview where you can hear what Desmond's actor Nolan North had to say about the spaceship ending.
The original story, as it was written, it was Desmond goes on these adventures, and they said, we're probably going to do about 6 games, and each game Desmond will get, this was the original pitch, Desmond would get the abilities of his, Altair, and now he has those, then it's Ezio, he has them, and then it's going to be this guy, and ultimately by the last game, he would be the ultimate assassin with all these, and be able to time travel back. Well, I know. Listen. This was one person told me this, so I may be speaking out of school. But it was like that would be, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. Because the first time I did that first game, I got to the end of the script, and in a 4-hour session, I think it took about 2.5 hours, and they said, okay, that's all. They said, all right, thanks, Nolan. We're good. I said, and I turned the last page, and I said, I'm just going to get a cup of coffee, and we'll start up again. And they looked at each other like, oh, that's it. Oh, what? This is awesome. What happens? And the writer goes, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? He said, I haven't written it yet. I'm like, wait. And seriously, I was kind of angry. I was like, wait, we're done? You just left me. Imagine getting to the best part of a book or a movie and then the end. You're like, huh? It was unbelievable, and I was so into it. I thought it was such a cool concept, such a cool story, and they just kind of dropped it.
So there you have it. We've reached the end of the video. If you are somehow still here, which I doubt, comment below the phrase, how dare they? And if I see that comment, I'll be sure to reply to it. Anyway, there's probably many more examples of cut content out there, but these are the ones I managed to find, confirm, and make educated guesses about. Other pieces of cut content that I know of that are not included in this video are very minor changes, and you would not even notice it in their respective retail games. Now, I'm fully aware that this video might contain 1 or 2 tiny errors because after all, I'm not perfect. So if you think I've made an error on any part of the video, be sure to let me know in the comment section below. Anyway, if you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button. My goal is to reach 50,000 subscribers by the end of May. So with that said, I'll see you in the next one.